In 1908, the tallest building in the world stood at the corner of Broadway and Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan. It was 612 feet of red brick and bluestone, capped with a bulbous dome and a lantern that glowed over the financial district like something shipped whole from the French countryside. 42 tons of bronze lined its lobby. 60 years later, every ounce of that bronze was stripped, sold, and carted off in trucks, and the tallest building ever purposefully demolished by its owner vanished from the skyline as if it had never existed. The company behind it made sewing machines. Isaac Merritt Singer was born in 1811 in Pittstown, New York, the 8th child of German immigrants. He wanted to be an actor. He toured the country with a small company called the Merritt Players, reciting Shakespeare in rented halls between stints as a laborer, a carpenter, and a machinist. In 1851, while working in a Boston machine shop owned by a man named Orson C. Phelps, Singer was handed a broken Lero and Blodgett sewing machine and asked to fix it. 11 days later, he had not just repaired the thing, he had designed a better one. His version used a straight needle with an eye at the point, a shuttle that moved in a straight line, and a presser foot that held the fabric in place. On August 12, 1851, he received U.S. patent number 8294. He was 40 years old. Singer did not invent the sewing machine. He would lose a patent infringement suit to Elias Howe in 1854. What Singer invented was the business model. He pioneered installment credit. A housewife could take a machine home for $5 down and start sewing that same day. By 1860, Singer's company was the largest sewing machine manufacturer on Earth. By the time Isaac died in 1875, in a mansion he'd built for himself in Devon, England, his estate was worth $13 million. He left it, unequally, to 20 of his children by 5 different women. His business partner, Edward Clark, was the more respectable of the two. Clark and Singer incorporated the Singer Manufacturing Company in 1863, and Clark steered the firm's money into Manhattan real estate. He hired the architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg to build the Dakota, the grand apartment building that still looms over Central Park West. Clark also commissioned other residential buildings through the 1880s. The Singer Manufacturing Company, it turned out, was as much a real estate operation as a sewing machine company. By the mid-1890s, Singer machines were being manufactured at a massive factory in Clydebank, Scotland, where 3,500 workers turned out 8,000 machines a week. The company had sales agencies in Paris, Rio de Janeiro, and dozens of other cities. It needed a headquarters that announced what it had become. Not a sewing machine shop, but a global industrial power, and it needed that headquarters in the only city that would take the announcement seriously. Frederick Gilbert Bourne became president of Singer in 1889. Under his leadership, the company expanded into European markets so aggressively that some historians would later call it one of the first modern multinational corporations. Bourne was a yachtsman, a member of the Jekyll Island Club, the private retreat sometimes called the Millionaires' Club, and a man who believed that buildings should announce things. In 1896, he hired a Brooklyn-born architect named Ernest Flagg to design a new headquarters at the corner of Broadway and Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan. Flagg was 39, a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, sent there on the patronage of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who happened to be his wife's cousin. Flagg had already designed the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington and buildings for the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. He was a classicist with a reformer's conscience, a man who would later write a book about building affordable small houses and lobby for zoning laws that let light reach the street. He believed that skyscrapers above 10 or 15 stories should be set back from the sidewalk, with towers rising from only a fraction of the lot. He would get the chance to prove it. The first Singer building at 149 Broadway went up between 1897 and 1898. 10 stories, red brick and stone, with a mansard roof. Respectable. But the company kept growing. In December 1897, Bourne bought 3 5-story buildings at 85 to 89 Liberty Street for an adjoining annex. The Bourne Building, which Flagg designed at 14 stories and which cost an estimated $450,000. By 1902, even the annex was not enough. Flagg began drafting plans for an addition that would dwarf the original. His first design called for 35 stories. The Singer Company looked at the plans and said, essentially, double it. In February 1906, the Singer Manufacturing Company announced it would build the tallest building in the world. The tower would rise from the middle of the existing 14-story base, occupying just 1/4 of the lot. Exactly the kind of slender setback design Flagg had been preaching. The tower floors were squares, 65 feet on a side. Revised plans filed in July 1906 provided for a more wind-resistant structure. Diagonal bracing at the corners, columns spaced 12 feet apart on center, the entire steel skeleton engineered by Otto F. Semch and consulting engineers Baller and Hodge. Over 40 companies were contracted for the work. Nearly 100 construction contracts were signed. The steel alone weighed more than 18,000 tons. Construction began in September 1906. While excavating the tower's foundation, workers sank caissons deep into the bedrock beneath Lower Manhattan. The base of the building could rest on shallower footings, but the tower needed to grip the island's bones. 20 months later, on May 1, 1908, the Singer Tower was finished. The roof stood 612 feet above Broadway. A 58-foot flagpole pushed the pinnacle to 670 feet. The only structure on Earth that stood taller was the Eiffel Tower. The newspapers, not known for restraint, called it the greatest engineering feat in the city's history. Others just called it the Singerhorn, a nickname borrowed from the Matterhorn, coined even before the building was completed, appearing in the New York Sun as early as December 1907. The lobby alone could have been a cathedral. 2 rows of 8 square piers, clad in Pavonazzo marble and trimmed with cast bronze beading, held up a ceiling of glazed plaster domes. At the top of each pier sat a large bronze medallion, some bearing the company monogram, others depicting a needle, thread, and bobbin. The pendentives between the domes were covered in gold leaf. Amber glass lights glowed behind steel frames in the ceiling drums. The entrance from Broadway was a 24-foot-high bronze grille. The elevator doors were bronze. The stair railings were bronze. The handrails, the newel posts, the balcony trim, all bronze. In total, 38 tons of ornamental bronze filled the building. More than 3,600 linear feet of cast bronze molding ran along the marble walls. 80 bronze medallions bearing the Singer trademark were embedded throughout. A master clock on the central staircase landing controlled every clock in the building. On the 34th floor, the Singer Company's executive offices featured oriental rugs, custom-designed mahogany furniture in the Empire style, and carved woodwork. The chief engineer, Otto F. Semch, wrote that the furniture was designed to appeal to the discriminating man and create the right impression upon all who see it. Below, in the basement, the Safe Deposit Company of New York had signed a 20-year lease for about 10,000 square feet of vault space. Ornate columns and arched vaults held up a series of small domes in what Semch described as a cathedral-like space. The building's boilers generated power for the entire structure. Nearly 1,600 steam radiators heated its rooms. 16 Otis electric elevators moved its tenants and visitors up and down. On June 23, 1908, the observation deck opened to the public. For 50 cents, roughly $18 today, visitors rode to the 40th floor and stepped out onto a balcony 564 feet above the curb. On a clear day, the view reached 30 miles in every direction. Newspapers called it the highest observation point in the world. The Evening World wrote that it afforded a view never before possible except from an airship. Some people, however, came to the observation deck for a different reason. After 2 people jumped to their deaths, newspapers gave the Singer Tower a second name, Suicide Pinnacle. The deck was closed by the 1930s. The Singer Building held the title of world's tallest for exactly 1 year. In 1909, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company Tower on Madison Avenue surpassed it at 700 feet. By 1913, the Woolworth Building had reached 792 feet. The skyline raced upward. The Singer Tower, with its red brick and its dome and its lantern, became just another silhouette in a city that was constantly adding new ones. But the lobby stayed. For decades, that lobby was a landmark of daily life in Lower Manhattan. Commuters passed through it. Businessmen held meetings beneath the bronze medallions. Manufacturers' Trust Company rented the mezzanine space in the early 1950s. On April 20, 1951, during Douglas MacArthur's ticker tape parade, employees stood on the parapet above the entrance and watched the General's motorcade crawl up Broadway. The building went on working. It held 410,000 square feet of office space, and the company projected rental income of $250,000 a year at a baseline rate of $3 per square foot. But those tower floors, 65-foot squares, 16 offices per story, were a problem that grew worse with every passing year. The narrow tower that Flagg had designed as a principled argument for light and air had become, by mid-century, an inefficiency. Businesses were expanding. They needed open floor plans, lateral space, room to spread. The Singer Tower had the opposite: small rooms stacked high, connected by 16 elevators that moved people vertically through a building. The modern office market was beginning to find useless. The very thing that had made the tower elegant in 1908, its slenderness, its restraint, the way it let sunlight pour into the streets below, now made it commercially obsolete. Flagg's design philosophy had also shaped the 1916 zoning resolution, New York's first set of laws governing building height and setback. The principles he championed, towers occupying a fraction of the lot, stepping back from the street to preserve light, became law. The Singer Building was the proof of concept, and the proof of concept was now worth more dead than alive. In 1957, Architectural Forum published a retrospective calling the Singer Building a very coherent, virile piece of design. The praise read, even then, like a eulogy. In 1961, the Singer Manufacturing Company announced it was leaving. The company moved uptown to 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and the building at 149 Broadway was put up for sale. According to property records, a woman named Rose Iacovoni purchased the Singer Building and immediately flipped it to a company called Financial Place, Inc. The building then passed to William Zeckendorf, one of the most aggressive real estate developers in post-war New York. Zeckendorf had a plan. He wanted the New York Stock Exchange to relocate from its headquarters on Broad Street into the Singer Building. It was a bold pitch, and it failed. The exchange opted to expand its existing building instead. The newspapers called the Singer Tower an architectural giraffe. Its height was impressive. Its usable space was not. No one wanted a 47-story monument to 1908 office planning. Meanwhile, a block away, something else was happening. The World Trade Center was being planned. Real estate values in Lower Manhattan were climbing. Every square foot of ground-level lot space in the financial district was being recalculated. In 1964, United States Steel bought the Singer Building and the adjacent City Investing Building. The plan was to demolish both structures and erect a single 54-story headquarters, a black steel and glass slab designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. One building replacing two. The new tower would contain 2.3 million square feet of usable interior space, with each floor offering nearly an acre of office area. That was more than twice the combined interior of the two buildings it would replace. By 1965, New York City had a Landmarks Preservation Commission. It had been created in the furious aftermath of the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in 1963, a loss that had shocked the city into realizing that legal protection for historic buildings was not optional. The Singer Building was one of the most iconic structures in New York. The LPC could have designated it a landmark, which would have blocked the wrecking ball. It did not. In August 1967, the Commission's executive director, Alan Burnham, offered an explanation. If the building were landmarked, he said, the city would have to either find a buyer or acquire the building itself. No one was going to do either. Sam Roberts would later write in the New York Times that the Singer Building was among the city's notable structures that simply weren't considered worth preserving. Preservationists protested. Architectural Forum magazine campaigned publicly. Some proposed incorporating the lobby into the new U.S. Steel Building, keeping the marble piers, the bronze, the gold leaf pendentives, embedding them in the base of the modern tower like a fossil in glass. The city approved the full demolition anyway. Demolition began in September 1967. Workers started at the top, cutting into steel beams with acetylene torches high above the intersection of Broadway and Liberty Street. The process was slow and methodical. No building this tall had ever been taken apart on purpose, and there were no standard procedures for it. Each beam had to be cut, lowered, and trucked away. The tower came down floor by floor, story by story, through the fall and winter of 1967 and into 1968. For months, Lower Manhattan commuters looked up and saw the Singer Tower getting shorter, the dome gone, then the upper stories, then more, a building being erased from the top down like a word being rubbed off a chalkboard. On October 15, 1930, decades before the demolition, during the building's working life, a 59-year-old wheelbarrow manufacturer named Austin Adams, Jr. had visited his attorney's office on the 24th floor. The lawyer was out. Adams sat in the waiting room, put aside his coat, hat, and umbrella, and began reading a magazine. When the other man in the room stepped out briefly and returned, Adams was gone. He had thrown himself from the office window and fallen to his death on the 14th floor setback. The police told reporters that Adams had been depressed over business difficulties. The observation deck had already earned its nickname. The building collected these stories the way old buildings do, quietly, one at a time, without comment. In March 1968, a reporter from the New York Times walked through the lobby and described what remained. The Italian marble had been stripped from many of the columns. The bronze medallions with the Singer monogram had been pulled off and were being offered for sale. Holes pocked the pendentives that had once supported the domes. Plaster flaked onto a floor covered in splintered wood, shattered brick, and discarded coffee cups. The lobby that Christopher Gray of the Times once described as exuding celestial radiance now looked, the reporter wrote, as if a bomb had hit it. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic who had helped galvanize the preservation movement and would go on to win the first Pulitzer Prize for criticism, watched the demolition and wrote about it. She described the building under demolition in terms borrowed from the 18th century Italian artist known for depicting grand ruins. The master engraver of imaginary prisons and crumbling Roman architecture, she said, never produced a more impressive ruin than the Singer Building coming down. The last scrap of steel was hauled away in early 1969. The New York Daily News ran a short item. The Singer Building, the paper observed, had fallen victim to a malady called progress. One Liberty Plaza opened on the same site in 1973. It is 743 feet tall, 54 stories of black structural steel designed in the international style. Merrill Lynch became an anchor tenant in 1972, occupying 40 floors. By the early 1980s, the brokerage firm owned the entire building, having bought it for $100 million. In 1984, Merrill Lynch sold One Liberty Plaza for $375 million to Olympia and York. Today, the building is owned and operated by Brookfield Properties. South of the tower sits Zuccotti Park, the small public plaza that U.S. Steel created as part of a zoning deal that allowed it to build 9 stories higher than regulations permitted. In 2011, that park became the staging ground for the Occupy Wall Street movement, a protest camp pitched on land that exists only because the Singer Building does not. The only physical remnants of the Singer Building that survive are a handful of chandeliers. They were salvaged from the Board of Directors room and carried across the East River to the Pratt Institute campus in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. There, in the East Building, originally the Mechanical Arts Building, which houses the oldest continuously operating, privately owned steam-powered electrical generating plant in the country, the chandeliers hang inside a room designed for a different century, surrounded by industrial artifacts collected over decades. Copper-plated cast-iron elevator lanterns from the Singer Building, with curvaceous arms and original porcelain sockets, have surfaced at architectural salvage dealers. Bronze medallions appear occasionally at auction. Fragments of the marble lobby were taken as souvenirs by people who worked there. One family kept slabs of the Pavonazzo marble, random bricks from the Demolition, and a bronze medallion from a folding elevator gate, all stored in the same house for decades. At the time of its destruction, the Singer Building was the tallest building ever demolished on purpose. It held that distinction for more than 50 years, until the 2019 demolition of 270 Park Avenue. The only taller buildings ever destroyed were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, built 1 block from where the Singer Tower once stood, opened 5 years after it was torn down, and brought down in 2001 by a force no one in 1908 or 1968 could have imagined. Ernest Flagg outlived his building by nothing. He died in 1947 at the age of 89, 20 years before the demolition began. He had spent his final decades on Staten Island, designing modest houses with modular floor plans, a system based on a 45-inch grid that reduced material waste and allowed standardized parts to be produced cheaply in quantity. He published a book about it in 1922 called Small Houses. The architect of the tallest building in the world spent the end of his life figuring out how to build the most ordinary ones. Frederick Bourne, the man who commissioned the tower, died in 1919 at his estate on Long Island. He was 67. He left behind 12 children, a membership at the Jekyll Island Club, and a summer house in the Thousand Islands. Isaac Singer died in 1875, 22 years before Flagg even drew the first plans. He never saw the building that carried his name. He never set foot in the marble lobby or rode the Otis elevators or looked out from the observation deck at 30 miles of coastline. He left behind a $13 million fortune, 26 children, and a patent for a machine that stitched a straight line. The New York Globe, writing when the tower was new, had called it an architectural giraffe. Papers worried that no fire department in the world could rescue anyone above the 30th floor. They were not wrong to worry, but the building stood for 60 years and no fire consumed it. No earthquake cracked its foundation. No economic collapse emptied it overnight. It simply became, in the language of real estate, uneconomical. The tower floors were too small. The floor plans were wrong. The bronze was worth more as scrap than as decoration. The land beneath it was worth more than everything above it. On a clear evening in 1908, you could have stood on Liberty Street and looked up at the Singer Tower glowing against the sky. Red brick, bluestone, a dome lit from within, a lantern at the top throwing light over the harbor, a flagpole reaching 670 feet into nothing, 42 tons of bronze behind the entrance grille, one master clock ticking on the central landing, keeping time for every room in the building. The address is 149 Broadway. Today, it is the east edge of One Liberty Plaza's footprint. There is no plaque. There is no marker. There is only the bronze somewhere, in a power plant in Brooklyn, in a salvage warehouse in Chicago, in a family's attic, still carrying the image of a needle, a thread, and a bobbin.